So, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Happy World Aquatic Animal Day. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this event, which marks a special day in the calendar. I'm Wasim Imam. I'm the founder and director of Ethical Seafood Research, or ESR as we're more commonly known, and I'll be your host for the next hour minus. So today's roundtable is actually the first of its kind. It's the first time these two organizations have co-hosted a roundtable. So that's the Global Research Network and ESR. I'm actually associated with both organizations, but my main affiliation is with ESR, just letting people in. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. And I'll hand over to Tom Nichols, who's here with us from the GRN. He's a technical director. I'll give him the floor in a second just to say some words about the GRN. Before I hand over to Tom, I'll just go through the agenda for the day and some housekeeping items. So, sorry, I'm just letting people in at the same time. Okay, so since we only have an hour for today, we have to be quite efficient with our time. Well, I'll just give a quick intro to ESR, and then we'll have four talks by our five wonderful speakers. We'll first hear from Amy, who will set the scene for us in terms of what World Aquatic Animal Day is all about. Then Alex and Gabriella, who are experts in EU law, will talk about the treatment of aquatic animals during slaughter in EU law. Kuhn will then give us an overview of just how effective current stunning solutions really are. Sorry, all this noise is from people entering. Just Okay, I think I admitted everyone. So yes, Kuhn will then give us an overview of just how effective current stunning solutions really are and where the science is with all of that. And we'll end with a presentation by Griffin, share with us the findings of his work on the economic feasibility of introducing electrical stunning in EU aquaculture. So we'll have all the presentations first, and then hopefully at the end we'll still have time for enough Q&A. In terms of housekeeping, please keep your mics muted to avoid any disturbance during the session, and feel free to pop any questions in the chat. We'll try to get to those at the end. The meeting is being recorded today so that we can broadcast it on YouTube to reach a larger audience, as is standard with most GRN events. And just a gentle reminder to be respectful in the chat and discussion, please. Thank you very much. So I'll hand over to Tom if you want to welcome people and tell us a bit more about GRN.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Dr. Tom Nichols. I'm the Technical Director of the Global Research Network think tank, and it's a pleasure to be with you today to help present this panel of experts for a very important discussion. If you'd like to find out more about our organisation or to become a member, to join the mailing list, then our website's found on grn.global. Thanks very much to Wasim for coordinating and facilitating this event. That's all I wanted to say, so I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Tom, for that. Warm welcome to our speakers and our audience, and for the introduction to the GRN. So just some words about ESR. Sorry, I'm just letting people in still. So ESR is primarily a research-oriented organization. We look for solutions to reduce the suffering of aquatic animals in the food system, in particular aquaculture. To date, our focus has been mostly on Africa, but we do also have projects in places like India and China. We are a non-profit in the UK, but we also have non-profit status in Spain and in Kenya, and soon we'll also have that in Egypt, where we have opened a field office actually at the end of last year. Apart from research, we also carry out training. So we have workshops and we get involved in educational seminars like this one, for example. We also advocate for policy change where we see opportunities. I know we're quite keen to steer countries in Africa in particular towards more ethical practice when we're talking about the quote unquote blue economy. So most of our work consists of active on-the-ground projects. That's in Egypt particularly, and Kenya and Tanzania. One of our core values at ESR is collaboration, and this roundtable is a perfect example of that. So GRN is one of our close partners, and I'll talk more about a project that we have going on at the end. But we work closely with a couple of the organizations that are represented by today's speakers. So yeah, ESR definitely believes in collaboration, and we think it's a key to overcoming some of the obstacles in the adoption of high welfare practices. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about why humane slaughter. If we can go next slide, Maya, please. Okay, yeah, that video does need to play, but basically, the humane slaughter is a very pertinent topic to us at ESR because aquatic animals in the food system are mistreated in general, but the way that they're removed from water and slaughtered is particularly stressful. When we're talking about aquaculture, but that's equally true in wild capture fisheries. And then we also have a project with GRN on humane slaughter. I'll talk about that later. So we are trying to do things on the ground. And let me tell you, it's not easy to get improvements in humane slaughter practices. We'll hear from Kuhn later on about all the challenges involved in stunning fish and other aquatic animals. So what they call the harvest process is known to be stressful, and we definitely feel that we can improve it. So that's what we're trying to do through this project that's highlighted here. And I hope that in time for the next World Aquatic Animal Day, I'll have some exciting updates for you on that project. Okay, so since we have Amy with us here, I think we can kick off with our presentations. I think we can. Amy is sharing her screen. Perfect. So first up, we have Amy P. Wilson, who has very kindly managed to find some time in her calendar to join us on this very busy day. Amy is joining us all the way from the USA, and it's a particularly busy day for her because World Aquatic Animal Day, or WAD, as I believe it's known, was in fact something that she co-founded. So we're very lucky to have her here with us today. Thank you for joining us, Amy. I'll let her tell us a bit more about how WAD came into existence, but first let me introduce her and give her a warm welcome. Amy is a South African licensed attorney with over 40 years of professional legal experience. She previously was practicing corporate and commercial law as a senior associate at a top African and international law firm. She then transitioned into focusing on attaining animal, human, and nature rights. And she founded the first dedicated animal law nonprofit in South Africa called Animal Law Reform South Africa. She's also a doctorate candidate, a research associate, and a lecturer with the University of Johannesburg, where she teaches courses on animal law. And among her long list of past experiences, just admitting more people in, um, Amy also focused on aquatic animal law during her time at Lewis and Clark in the US. Welcome, Amy. And the title of Amy's talk is Swimming Towards Compassion, Legal Protection for Aquatic Beings. Please take us away, Amy.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the intro, Wasim, and thanks to ESR and the Global Research Network for hosting this event. I'm really glad to be with you and that we're raising the platform for aquatic animals. So I have just a very short presentation today, which I'm hoping to kind of situate the idea of how WAD came about and also just discuss in general the need for it. So by now, hopefully, you know, WAD is World Aquatic Animal Day, and it's an annual day to raise awareness every year on the 3rd of April about these often forgotten and mistreated non-human animals. It's also about celebrating their lives, recognizing that they have capacities, uniqueness, and intrinsic value as individuals. And that's in addition to the other values that they have. We tend to focus on the economic value. Wasim just mentioned the blue economy, but they do also have individual lives and intrinsic value, and they are deeply spiritual and culturally relevant for many people. It's also a call to action to protect them, whether this is through education, through law and policy, as we're going to be talking about today, outreach, and other forms of advocacy. So I just want to do a shout out to Kathy Hessler, who's the Dean of the Animal Legal Education Initiative at George Washington, because her and I came up with this idea a couple of years ago. It's in its 6th year now, and really it's gone global, which is really exciting because that's exactly what we wanted to do. But why? Why did we decide that we needed a WAD and a dedicated day? Well, aquatic animals and all animals are considered as property in the law. So they are seen as a resource. People talk about them as natural resources, and they lack legal standing and protections. And not only that, they are systematically, as aquatic animals, excluded from pretty much every major legislation that protects animals. And I'll give a few examples in a moment. And this has led to their mass scale abuse, exploitation, and harm. And they also exist across a variety of uses. So people focus on food, but they exist in laboratories, they exist as companion animals in people's homes. And it was a need to give them some kind of visibility because they really are invisible to us. We don't exist in water environments as Homo sapiens. So we really need to bring them to our consciousness. And then we can start to unpack how we can protect them. And part of the reason is that we also have these biases against them. We've been taught from a young age that fishes fishes and aquatic animals are unintelligent, they lack memory, and various other things. And this is, in fact, deeply untrue once we start to realize the growing body of science that recognizes their abilities to suffer. They are able to take care of their young. They're able to have self-awareness. Cephalopods can pass the marshmallow test. There's a huge plethora of, awareness and capacities that these animals have. So we can't just simply look at them as resources. We can't see them as alternatives or solutions, whether we're pushing a blue economy narrative or otherwise. And we need to stop thinking of them as limitless and plentiful. So part of this day is breaking apart those misconceptions, highlighting the scope of harm, and also providing a platform for research and discussion. Okay, I'm not even going to talk about the aquatic animal environmental harms. That's all just the aquatic animals as individuals. And we start to see when we compare it to other animals that they are killed in the trillions. So while we have statistical information for land terrestrial animals who are utilized in food systems, we really have no idea how many animals we are killing and exploiting in water bodies, whether those are freshwater, brackish, or oceanic environments. We can estimate, and how we can estimate is by taking the data that we do have, which is tonnage, by the way. The best data we have is from the State of the World Fisheries report prepared by the FAO, and then we can kind of guesstimate based on their average weight. So closest estimates are that there are trillions, and some estimates show that just in terms of shrimp, we are killing about 76 trillion per year, and that amount is really unfathomable for us as humans to understand. So starting to see them not just as numbers or tonnage, but starting to see them as individuals. And when we do that and we look at the legal frameworks and the regulatory and governance around them, we start to see the systematic exclusion of them is problematic. And today we're talking about humane slaughter, but just two examples to highlight that in South Africa, the primary laws governing animals protection and cruelty, aquatic animals are not explicitly mentioned, and there's some debate as to whether they are in fact included at all. And in the Meat Safety Act, which governs welfare at the time of death and slaughter and leading up to slaughter, aquatic animals are not listed in the schedule of animals. So they are systematically excluded from the very legislation meant to protect humane slaughter of animals. And similarly, in the USA, the legal framework at a federal level, the Animal Welfare Act, aquatic animals are not included in that legislation aside from marine mammals. They are not even included in the definition of animals. So again, they are excluded because of that, and they're also excluded because they are used for food. They are similarly excluded from the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act, which regulates welfare at the time of killing. So these are just two examples. I could pull out a plethora of legislation at a state level that does this, but we start to see how this is problematic. And hopefully today the discussion will raise that in some of the other countries as well. So part of it is to not just see them as seafood and see them as this limitless resource, but start to see and consider the individuals. And when we do that, we can advocate for better frameworks, whether that's revolutionary in respect of animal rights, or whether that's advocating for incremental welfare changes at the time of slaughter in terms of their rearing when they're caught on boats, however it is, starting to see these as individuals. And then we can understand, respect, appreciate, and protect them. So thank you for this event today. There's some debate about whether we should be even talking about how to do this properly, or whether we should be doing it at all. But the reality is we need to do things better. No matter how we do them, we're doing it wrong. So hopefully today we can come to some sort of discussions, and I really encourage you to think about how you can advocate for these beings in whatever space you're in whatever context that you're in, and really give them the visibility they deserve, because our common future as Earthlings depends on it. So yeah, that's just my very quick, brief introduction, and I look forward to the other panels. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that inspiring presentation and the important call to action. We really do need to up our game in terms of legal protection for aquatic animals. So thanks for all the great work that you and Kathy have done in creating World Aquatic Animal Day. And thanks for the reminder that when we say aquatic animals, we're also talking about shrimp and so many other, not just fish, as most people tend to think. I know that you'll have to run off to your other events shortly and you won't stick around for Q&A. So I think Maya has already put your contact information here in the chat. if anyone wants to reach out to you with any questions, please feel free to do that. And good luck with your other events today. Thank you very much, Amy. So next up, we have Alice and Gabriella from the European Institute for Animal Law. And if you want to share your screen, or EALP, as I believe you're also referred to. So EALP and ESR actually recently published a research note on the treatment of wild-caught fish under EU law. We'll also pop a link in the chat here to that in case anyone's interested. To introduce both our speakers, Alice Di Concetto is the Executive Director and Chief Legal Advisor at the European Institute for Animal Law and Policy. She's also a lecturer in EU Animal Law and Ethics at Sciences Po in Paris, where she graduated herself with a master's in law back in 2015. She also holds a master's degree from Lewis and Clark Law School in Animal Law, where she was there as a Fulbright scholar before completing a fellowship in animal law and policy at Harvard Law School from 2016 to 2018. Gabriela Kubikova is also joining on the same presentation. She's a policy advisor also at EALP, let's say, and she's a lawyer by training, having previously advised the Brussels office of Compassion World Farming from 2021 to 2024. Before that, she was at the European Parliament in Agri Secretariat and the European Commission, and she holds a PhD in law from Charles University in Prague, where she specialized in EU farm animal law. Their joint talk is entitled The Treatment of Fishes During Slaughter in EU Law. A warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us, and please take us away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much to the Ethical Seafood Research and Global Research Network for inviting us to speak today in recognition of very important World Aquatic Animal Day. As you said, our presentation will focus on the treatment of fishes during slaughter in EU law. Each year, it is estimated that between 500 million to 1.3 billion farm fishes are slaughtered in the EU. Most farm species include trout, sea bass, sea bream, carp, and tuna. But despite being the second most farm animals in the EU after chickens, the legal protection of fishes is far from ideal. The European Union is often perceived to be a very progressive jurisdiction when it comes to legal protection of animals, including fishes. And it is true that EU law indeed includes provisions on fish welfare. However, these provisions are mostly detached from the best available science, and in most cases so vague in general that they struggle to provide fishes with any effective protection in practice. This presentation will have two parts. In the first part, Alice will tell you more about the rules that apply to fishes before slaughter. And in the second part, I will focus on the treatment of fishes at slaughter in the EU.
All right. Thank you, Gabriella. So before we dive into the specific rules that apply to fish at slaughter, let's turn to first, EU constitutional law, since the EU is one of the few jurisdictions around the world to recognize animals as sentient beings, and also, perhaps most importantly from a legal perspective, to impose on the Union and the member states to take into account the welfare requirements of animals in the formulation and implementation of EU policies, including fisheries policies and including agricultural policies. And actually, the recognition of animal sentience is consistent with the best available science. So if you look at the scientific opinions by the European Food Safety Authority, the European Food Safety Authority is an independent EU agency that advises the EU institutions, and most particularly the European Commission, on anything related to animal welfare science. And so EFSA has recognized in at least two scientific opinions that fish were sentient. So in a scientific opinion from 2009, EFSA found that there was some evidence for neural components of sentience in some species of fish. And of course, now we know that it actually is the case for all fishes and all species of fishes. And back in 2004, the EFSA also found that affective states of pain, fear, and stress are likely to be experienced by fish. So if you look at the EU regulatory framework when it comes to farm animal welfare law, there are 7 pieces of legislation. So just a comment here that there are 2 types of EU legislation called directives and regulations. And despite their names, directives and regulations are both binding to the member states, to EU citizens. So if you look at the 7 pieces of legislation, there are actually 3 that cover fishes. So it's not probably different from US federal law or South African law. We have legislation in the EU that do include fishes in their scope. But of course, and sadly, there are significant limitations to the protection of fishes in those statutes. So first off, you'll notice that there's no species-specific legislation applicable to fishes. We do have species-specific legislation for some terrestrial animals, such as egg-laying hens or pigs, but not for fish. But we do have this general legislation that applies to all farmed animals, including fishes, which is Directive 98/58, commonly referred to as the General Farming Directive. But this directive only contains very general provisions. So I've put a few here. There's no really quantifiable standards, and therefore those provisions are not very effective to protect fishes. And it's not just us at the Institute who say that the law and specifically the General Farming Directive should be reformed. The European Commission, in its evaluation of EU farm animal welfare legislation in 2022, also recognized that there was a suboptimal level of welfare of animals in the EU, and particularly for those species that were not covered by a species-specific statute, which is the case for fishes. Now turning to the transport regulation that regulates the transport of animals. So this regulation applies to all fishes, so wild-caught and farm fishes. But of course, wild-caught fishes tend to be killed aboard fishing vessels and are not technically transported. So regardless, in theory, that the transport regulation applies to all fishes. But it suffers from the same limitation as the General Farming Directive in that the provisions are very vague. There is no standards governing loading and unloading operations in tank. The regulation doesn't provide maximum density levels in tanks during transport, and so on. And again, so the European Parliament identified those shortcomings in the transport regulation. So the European Parliament, the members of the European Parliament stated that the transport regulation suffered from unclear legislative provisions, misleading requirements, lack of clear definitions that led to systematic violations, uneven applications of the rules, thereby increasing the risks for animals and for their well-being. And that obviously is the case for fishes as well. Now, the transport regulations, the transport regulation is actually under revision. So the draft proposal that was published by the European Commission includes species-specific standards for the transport of aquatic animals, but those standards are, at least in our opinion, too vague to produce regulatory effects. So there are provisions, for instance, mentioning water quality, but again, there's no quantifiable standards that operators should comply with. And with that, I'll hand it over or back to Gabriela to discuss more specifically the treatment of fishes at slaughter.
Thank you very much, Alice. Can you please move to another slide? Yes, thank you very much. So Regulation 1099/2009, which I will refer to as the slaughter regulation, is the main act on the protection of animals at the time of killing. It covers all animals bred and kept for the production of food, but fishes are excluded from the entirety of this act apart from one provision in Article 3, which is basically a general principle that animals shall be spared any avoidable pain, distress, or suffering during killing and related operations. At the same time, fish slaughterhouses do not fall within the definition of a slaughterhouse because according to the slaughter regulation, that is an establishment that only slaughters terrestrial animals. While the EU legislature acknowledges that separate standards should be established on the protection of fish at killing in the preamble of the slaughter regulation, no such standards have been introduced since the adoption of the regulation. And what is the result of this exclusion of fishes from the slaughter regulation? First of all, there is no requirement to stun fishes before slaughter, and that leads to very sad statistics. In the EU, less than 10% of carps and less than 5% of sea basses and sea breams are stunned before slaughter. Cruel methods of slaughter are routinely used, and that includes those slaughter methods which are not in compliance with the guidelines by the World Organization for Animal Health. In 2018, the European Commission published a report which found that the level of compliance with these guidelines differs quite significantly based on species. And for example, for sea bass and sea bream, there is a significant lack of compliance, as these fishes are still routinely and mainly killed through asphyxiation in ice or ice slurry, which is a non-compliant method. For salmon, trout, or carp, there is a potential to achieve compliance. But the European Commission found that they lack data on the effectiveness of the equipment, or in some cases, the methods that were used were compliant, but they were used in a way that actually led to animal suffering. And what also needs to be highlighted that fishes can be sold live to consumers and slaughtered at home by people who have no training. This is very common in Czechia, Slovakia, or Poland around Christmas time, when carps are sold on markets, brought by people home, kept in bathtubs for a few days, and then slaughtered, which of course further jeopardizes the welfare of these animals. Apart from conventional farming, European law also regulates organic farming. And the organic farming regulation focuses mainly on the standards for the keeping of animals, but there are a few provisions for the transport or slaughter as well, and that includes fishes. Particularly, the regulation requires that slaughter techniques shall render fish immediately unconscious and insensible to pain, and handling should be made in a way that prevents injuries. However, as you can see, this is quite a vague provision, so its practical effect is once again doubtful. It is important to highlight that EU law only sets a minimum standard that each member state should achieve. However, if member states are willing, they are welcome to achieve more stricter rules to protect animals. We can give you a few examples. For example, in Germany and Czechia, legislation requires stunning of fishes at slaughter. In the Netherlands, Dutch law requires stunning of eels. And to give you a non-EU, albeit European example, is Norway, one of the main exporters of salmon to the European Union, not the United States. Norway requires stunning of fishes at slaughter and only allows certain stunning methods. For example, the use of CO2 is prohibited, and the same also goes for emergency killing. Animal welfare legislation in the EU should be science-based. And the slaughter regulation explicitly says that there are no recommendations of fishes because there is a need for more scientific research and economic analysis. However, a few months before the slaughter regulation was published in the official journal, EFSA, which is the advisory body that Alice mentioned earlier, published 8 scientific opinions on the welfare aspects of slaughter of the most farmed fish species and identified 3 main hazards: handling, quality of water in the holding tanks or pens, and stunning and killing methods. These 8 scientific opinions included recommendations, some of them, for example, not to use methods such as live chilling in ice water slurry. However, in the 16 years since the adoption, they have not been implementing in the slaughter regulation. In 2020, the European Commission adopted the Farm to Fork strategy, which was basically its flagship policy that included a set of measures and actions to contribute to a more sustainable food system in the EU. And animal welfare was acknowledged as a part of the concept of sustainability. So for that reason, this strategy foresaw evaluation and revision of animal welfare legislation. The evaluation found that while fish sentience is recognized by scientists, it is not reflected in EU law, as there are no species-specific standards for fishes. Some processes during slaughter were explicitly called especially inhumane. So this evaluation found there is an urgent need for specific requirements for fish slaughter, which should be adopted. As we know from the leaked documents, the European Commission planned to actually adopt rules on the mandatory stunning of fishes before slaughter. However, while this revision was expected by the end of 2023, this did not happen, and there were only two proposals, one on transport, which Alice mentioned to you earlier, and one on the protection of cats and dogs. This U-turn has many different reasons. First of all, it was intense lobby efforts, then it was farmers' protests preceding the European Parliament elections, and finally, the election campaign that painted all green measure as damaging for EU agriculture and aquaculture. So at this time, the European Commission claims that the slaughter regulation, or the whole animal welfare package, is undergoing revision, but we have no specific timeline and its fate is currently unknown. So we are hoping that we will actually see the revision this term, and of course, at the Institute, we will try to achieve that. And with that, I will hand over to Alice for the final conclusions. Alice, unmute yourself.
Thanks. So yeah, the main takeaways of this presentation is that wild fishes are considered sentient beings in EU law. Wild fishes are excluded from virtually all pieces of EU animal welfare legislation, either because they're not covered in the scope of animal welfare laws, or because when they are covered in the scope of animal welfare statutes, no specific provision actually applies to fish. There exists more rules on the slaughter of fishes in the EU organic regulations, but again, those provisions are too vague to produce any tangible regulatory effects. But we've also seen that in some member states, there are stricter rules on fish welfare, particularly at slaughters, such as in Czechia or the Netherlands. And sadly, perspectives on reforms are limited at the moment, since the future of EU farm animal welfare revision is uncertain. So I'll conclude by saying that I'll skip that because Wasim kindly mentioned the research note that we worked on together. And I'll just say that we have a newsletter, so please subscribe. It's free. It provides all the latest updates in EU animal law and policies, so please don't hesitate to subscribe from our website. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your questions or comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both of you for that great presentation. It's really nice to always see the updates in EU law and policy and how things are going, and we really do hope to see the revision of the animal welfare legislation this year. And we want to see the EU doing a lot more in terms of, humane slaughter of aquatic animals. I have a number of questions myself, but maybe I'll keep them until the end if we have time. So now that we've covered the legal framework, well, the absence rather, let's say, of a legal framework for humane slaughter of aquatic animals, we can move on to the technical aspects of stunning, and we'll look at just how effective current technology is for humane slaughter. Koen, do you want to share your? Yeah.
Yes.
To give us an overview, we're grateful to have Koen here with us, Koen van Pelt, who has taken the time out of his very busy schedule to join us. He has a background in maritime engineering, and he's currently undergoing incubation with charity entrepreneurship run by Ambitious Impact. That's why he's so busy these days. He spent the last year and a half researching electrical stunning machines, so he's become quite knowledgeable on the ins and outs of how they work. He actually has a really nice report on that we'll put in a chat shortly. So he also was working on starting his own charity in the Mediterranean to promote the electrical stunning of farmed sea bass and sea bream. And he spent some time learning all about how these machines work. And that's the report that I mentioned. And over to you. Your talk is entitled How Effective Are Current Stunning Solutions? A warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wasim, for the introduction. Just a quick check. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thank you, Wasim and the Global Research Network for hosting this. So as Wasim mentioned, I have a background in maritime engineering. I'm going to be giving a short talk about the efficacy of aquatic animal stunning. Wasim already gave a short intro, so I'll quickly touch upon that. I previously tried launching a charity to promote electrical stunning for sea bass and sea bream in Mediterranean. After that, I spent quite some time researching these systems because I found them very interesting. I think there could be a very interesting intervention to help animals and fish. And since then, I've joined an incubator to try to launch a new charity, and I'm going to be trying to launch a new charity in Southeast Asia, focused on improving the lives of fish there. What I'll talk about today, I'll first give a quick overview of the stunning practices that currently exist, mostly looking into electrical and percussive. Then I'll go into how we actually measure the efficacy. How do we know if a fish is actually unconscious? And then I'll go into what the current evidence actually shows. As a quick background, I guess this has already been mentioned, but why this matters, slaughtering without stunning can lead to extreme suffering for fish. Most fish are either suffocated or chilled to death, which is often very slow and painful. One example for this is that sea bass and sea bream can stay conscious for between 5 to 40 minutes if they're being killed without stunning. Just looking at the numbers, if we only look at finfish, combining both the farmed and the wild caught, there's roughly 50,000 finfish being slaughtered every second. And if we then look at how much each of them suffers during this, I think this is a really big problem. And effective stunning could massively reduce this suffering. So that's why I wanted to talk about that today. So I'm diving straight in with how stunning actually works. I'll first go into electrical stunning. After this, I have a slide on percussive stunning. There's also some other types of stunning, such as chemical stunning or gas stunning. But these two are the main focus of the presentation, as these are also the only ones that are actually being used right now. So electrical stunning, there's currently two methods for this. On the top, you see dry electrical stunning systems. They're quite simple. Fish get out of the water, they're being dewatered, and then they go into a conveyor belt. This conveyor belt moves forward, and at some point, these fish make a contact between electrodes that are hanging above the conveyor belt, and then a current passes from these electrodes to the conveyor belt, which runs an electrical current through their heads, and they get stunned. On the top right, you see one of these systems. This is the system that's currently being built and sold by Optimal. This is a shrimp stunner, but there's also some other companies, such as Smilfish, making them in Turkey. The other method for electrical stunning is in water stunning. This works the same by passing an electrical current through the heads of the animals, but in this case, the animals are still submerged. They go through a pipe, and on both sides of the pipe, there's a metal plate that provides an electrical current through the water, and this also stuns them just like the dry electrical stunning system. On the bottom right, you can see one of these systems as is currently sold by Aquatic. In this case, also one for shrimp, but for finfish, it looks the same. It's just slightly bigger. Then the other system that is currently being used and sold is percussive stunning. This is very similar to what people do in the recreational fisheries. So it's basically just hitting the fish on the head with a very hard blow, and this renders them unconscious. Most available systems work by first aligning the fish under a percussive piston, to make sure that the fish are being hit in the right location. As you can see on the left, and on the right you see one of these systems as built by Bader. These are currently mostly used for salmon in Norway or Scotland, and these systems are quite a bit more expensive and also larger than electrical stunning systems that I mentioned before. Okay, then how do we know if a stun is effective? First, I'll quickly try to introduce like what does an effective stun actually mean, and what I'm assuming for that in this presentation. So ideally, it means immediate and irreversible unconsciousness that lasts until death. So for a system, it's not enough to actually render the animal unconscious. It has to remain unconscious until the end of life. Because if it regains consciousness before it's actually being killed in the eyes or by kill cutting, then you haven't actually achieved anything. So how do we assess if this is working? There's two methods for this. First, in the labs, when we're testing these machines, we use EEGs. These are electroencephalograms, and they basically look at the brain activity of fish. One common method for this is displayed on the top right, and this is the visually evoked response. It basically works by removing the fish from the water and attaching electrodes to their heads, and then by providing an external stimuli, we can see if the brain is still reacting. So in this case, it's being removed from the water and put inside of a box, and then they flash a light in front of the head. And if we can see the brain waves responding to this light, we can assume it's still conscious. If it doesn't respond anymore, or if the waveform is smaller, it isn't conscious anymore. Because this is quite difficult, it requires quite some machinery, it requires quite some skills. It isn't really being used in the field. So in the field, we mostly use behavioral science, and this can include breathing, eye movement, or trying to right themselves. And the last one is displayed on the bottom right. This is quite simple. You can just pick up fish in the field and move them around. And then if the eyes remain on the same plane, so if they remain horizontal, you can, with some reliability, state that the fish is still conscious. But if the eyes are moving along with the body, you can say they're unconscious. Now, going into how effective these solutions actually are, I'm first going to go into the literature, and then after this, I'll go into some expert views that I wrote down after having some interviews and discussions with academics. So looking at the literature, I have to say I was quite surprised by this. It isn't looking great for stunning. So firstly, one thing that's coming up over and over again is that these behavioral signs can be quite misleading. It can happen easily that these fish may appear unconscious, but when they actually hook them up to an EEG, they aren't actually unconscious. Also, looking at how effective these systems are, they show very mixed results, especially for the electrical stunning machines. It is quite common that these fish recover before they actually die. And even if everything is going perfect, the effectiveness is often around 90 to 80%. It's never close to 100%. But then when we actually transfer these systems to the field, it's usually even worse. This can be for a wide range of different reasons. And often it's just that the methods aren't being used well. So in the lab, they often have only a small number of animals going through them. They can make sure that all the settings are optimal and that it's being used correctly. In the field, this is often just not the case. But there's also some other problems that seem more difficult to solve. So for example, if you're using these in water systems, it's quite difficult to actually use the right voltage because the water conductivity can change a lot. And you cannot really predict which settings you need for which location. They also, the research also shows that percussive stunning seems to be a bit better than electrical stunning. However, these percussive stunning systems are much more tricky to actually scale up. They work really well for bigger fish, such as salmon, but when you try to use them for sea bass or sea bream or other small fish, it's very difficult to have them do a lot of fish at the same time, which can really influence how much influence the operations of a fishing vessel or an aquaculture facility. And then also a lot of research finds that the timing really matters. Quite often there's too much delay before the killing. So there's too much time in between the stunning and the killing, leading to the fish regaining consciousness before they're actually dead. Then going into the expert views. So this is based on a couple of discussions I've had with the academics who have been publishing these studies. I've talked to a wide range of academics. Some of them are more positive, some are more skeptical, but in general, most seem to be quite skeptical. There seems to be some common agreement that at least what the current stunning companies are saying about the efficacy is a pretty big overestimate. Some of them even mention that their systems have 100% efficacy on their website, and that's basically impossible. Even for most land animals, we aren't reaching that percentage. And then it also shows, again, that percussive stunning looks more promising, at least in the labs. There haven't been many studies actually looking at how well these work in the field. And then going into disagreements within the experts, there is a very big disagreement in how to interpret the difference between these behavioral indicators and these EEG data or these brain scans. So there are a couple of researchers who say that we can only go with these EEG scans, and the result of that is that they are way more skeptical about the effectiveness of stunning, often saying that it's sometimes even embarrassing how well they work in the field. But then some other researchers who say that EEG is way too conservative, and who think that behavioral indicators are a very good proxy for consciousness, they seem to be much more optimistic. But then those researchers are also often working together with the people that make these stunning methods. So I don't really know how to value those different opinions. Then the overall conclusions on effectiveness, I've tried asking all of them if they could give me a percentage on how much percent of the animals actually going through one of these systems are still unconscious when they're being killed. And they wouldn't really give me this percentage, but based on this talks I had with them, my best guess is that it's somewhere between 40 and 80%, which I think is really bad. I was quite shocked by this. It is very difficult to put a number behind this just because there's also not that much research. I should also note that the industry representatives tend to be much more optimistic, but when actually asking them about what this is based on, they never have studies actually using these EEG methods, and they only use these more basic methods based on behavioral indicators. So where does it leave us? Stunning of aquatic animals is not perfect. It's not even close. If you compare it to the current situation with land animals, for which it's quite often close to 95% or maybe 100, there's a very big difference. But I do think that even imperfect stunning can still reduce the suffering a lot. Just because we're talking about so many animals, there's so much suffering. And I think that if we have a scenario, and let's say it's like 50% of the animals get stunned correctly, 50% don't get stunned correctly, which is, I think, quite conservative. I'm not sure if that's correct. But then for this 50% that do get stunned, you are removing suffering on a time scale of 10 to 20, 30 minutes. Whilst for the other 50%, you might be adding a little bit of suffering by electrocuting them, but that's only on the time scale of seconds. So I think overall, it's still a good thing to push for. However, there should be much more research into how to actually improve them. Based on that, I also want to advise that we need much more researchers in this field. Currently, only 5% of finfish worldwide are being stunned, and we only have some research into the most farmed fish, but there's hundreds of types of different fish around the world. We don't yet know how to stun them. And if we know how to stun them, we don't know how to effectively do this. And as a last note, I also want to say that 2 of the academics mentioned that many researchers in this field are closing in on retirement, and there's not enough people entering the field to actually replace them. One of them mentioned that there's maybe 10 to 15 people in the world who can do these EEG measurements. So if there's anyone out there in this meeting who might be interested in looking into this, please reach out to me. I might be able to connect you, because I think it would be extremely valuable to have more people looking into this. That's it. Thank you for listening. If there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Koen, for that great overview of the current technology of how to stun aquatic animals. It definitely does require a bit of studying to really understand just how everything works. And but thank you for breaking it down for us so expertly. And like you said, there's so much debate about whether stuns are effective or not, and sometimes we don't even know if we're doing things right or making things better. But I think somehow an imperfect stun is still likely to be better than nothing, as long as we're not immobilizing and like torturing fish, aquatic animals, sorry. And that's exactly what we've learned in Egypt, for example, that, we were hoping to bring in electrical stunning, but then we realized that actually guaranteeing that we have enough ice to, carry out the slaughter part is not enough. So now we're thinking, okay, how do we improve the ice part of that? So it's a big challenge, definitely. And I think not enough people are aware of that when they're pushing for, humane slaughter. There are challenges there. So we do need to know what we're talking about. I had no idea that you were starting your own charity on fish in Asia or aquatic animals, but very excited to hear that, and I'll be keen to see how you get on, and best of luck with that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you again. Yeah. So we're on to our last presentation of the day. We looked at the legal aspects, and now we've heard about the technical aspects of humane slaughter. So what about the financial side of it all? Is it economically feasible to ask those that work with aquatic animals, like the producers and so on, to bring in humane slaughter technologies? To help answer that question, we have Griffin Carpenter here with us today. Griffin is an environmental economist, specializing in the impact assessment of European policies. He has assessed policies in the domains of capture fisheries, aquaculture, electric vehicles, and the exotic pet trade. It's quite a diversity there. And he is currently working as an independent consultant based out of Brussels. I actually attended a talk that he gave at a recent Intergroup for Animals meeting in the European Parliament and on this topic, and I found it very interesting. So I asked him if he would mind sharing his work with us today, and I'm really glad he agreed. So thank you for joining us. The title of his talk is Stunning Results in EU Aquaculture, an Economic Feasibility Assessment of Electrical Stunning. A warm welcome to you as well, Griffin, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. So there you have it. The title's on the screen. We're looking at whether a legislative requirement for effective stunning, which for the species we're looking at would be electrical stunning, whether that would be economically feasible. So just a little bit of context. Much of this has been covered in the previous presentations. But there's growing interest in fish welfare in the sector, especially later down in the supply chain, kind of on the retail side. And in surveys of the public, there's large support for requirements for pre-slaughter stunning, kind of 70% range. The common methods have been covered: fish on ice, asphyxiation, which has huge welfare concerns. Whereas for effective stunning, we just saw Koen's presentation, far from perfect, but seems like an improvement. And the methods, again, we'd be looking at here are the two electrical methods. So if you remember Koen's presentation, that would be the essentially the tube with a pump, the in-water system, or the dry electrical stunning, that kind of conveyor belt with the chain that completes the circuit when a fish passes through. The main fin fish aquaculture species in the EU are carp, rainbow trout, sea bass, and sea bream. So those are the species we're covering. On an annual basis, that's about 435 tons of production. In terms of number of fish, if we convert using average weights, it's kind of 610 million a year, so well beyond the EU population every year passing through, and an economic value that's 2 billion. So effective stunning, with the caveats Koen mentioned, seems to improve welfare during slaughter. The question is it economically feasible? And when I think about this question, I kind of break it down as a series of questions to answer, and potentially the study would end depending on the results of the question. So first, do these stunning methods increase production costs? Well, if they don't increase production costs, then we're all done. Economic feasibility remains as it is today. But let's assume production costs are increased with the new equipment. So moving on. Can those increased costs be passed on through higher prices? If you're the aquaculture producer, if you have some extra costs, but then you just pass along through higher prices, again, your bottom line hasn't actually changed there. So no problem, feasibility remains as today. Let's assume they can't pass on all the costs. Moving on, any remaining costs that they couldn't pass on, can those be absorbed by their bottom line? Are there already profits in this industry? Is there already some headroom in which aquaculture producers could absorb those costs as a part of doing business? And based on the answer to that question, we can finally say, what do we know about economic feasibility for this sector with these technologies? So we're actually in an okay position here to answer these questions. The Joint Research Center of the European Commission every 2 years collects a survey of aquaculture producers, and they ask them, what was your turnover, what were your labor costs, what were your energy costs, etc. So we actually know quite a lot about the economic state of these businesses. And it's broken down by sector. It's not every single business that have confidentiality issues, but we'd break it down by sectors or segments. So there's 17 different segments of interest to us here. An example would be a combination of a species, a country, and a production type. Carp, raised in large ponds in Poland. That's one little sector, and we know their economic data. Of the 17, 16 are currently profitable. And actually, the margins are pretty decent. So 11 of those 17 have profit margins above 10%. So this will be quite relevant later on when we're looking at feasibility. We also have data on the cost of stunning equipment. As Gun was just showing, some of it exists, it's in use, so we know how much the costs are. Put all together the system, it's kind of 220,000 euros. You don't pay that every year. You buy the equipment, let's say a 10-year depreciation. So we're looking at costs about 26,000 a year. So what we're going to do is look at the current economic state, the profitability of these segments, add on these extra costs, and then see if we're still above the magic zero line. Are there still profits in the industry? Can they absorb those costs? So the first question is, how much do costs increase? So I mentioned we're kind of looking at 26,000 euros a year. Along the bottom here, we have the different species. So you can see the different types of carp, which is on the left, sea bass, sea bream, which are usually raised together in the middle, and rainbow trout on the right. So the question, do the stunning methods increase production costs? Yes, as expected. There's a but. So overall, as a kind of crude average, increased cost by about 2%. More for carp, you see on the left there, lowest for sea bass, sea bream. Trout, about 2%. Some are actually negative costs, which might be confusing, but that's because stunning doesn't exist by itself. Stunning is part of a whole series of technologies that are applied, including a pump, which speeds up production. And labor is quite expensive. So if you can lower your labor costs, it actually outweighs the capital costs of adding the new equipment. So that's why you see negative results there in some high-wage countries like Denmark. Okay, so we have some that are above zero. There are costs to adding these new technologies. Can they be passed on through higher prices? There's no easy answer to this question. We know the main dynamics, though. So the main dynamics is about competition. If everybody at the same time is forced to have this new equipment, then all production increases cost together, the prices are passed on. If there's some competitors that don't have this technology requirement, then it's more difficult to pass on the extra costs. So if the EU is considering this, the international competition is a concern. Now, somewhat surprisingly, although aquaculture imports are significant in the EU, you might think salmon coming from Norway, tropical shrimp from half the world, that's not actually what we're talking about here. We're talking about these finfish species, and the EU is the biggest producer of the EU consumption market. You see the percentages there, 70, 80, 86% for the different species, meaning if EU producers have a legislative requirement for effective stunning here, there would be pricing power where the producers can pass that on to the market because a minority of the market is supplied internationally. The last question was about absorbing any remaining costs. And so here we're putting a bit of the information together. On the graph here, the dark blue is their current profitability. As I mentioned, 16 of the 17 segments are currently profitable. You'll see it's just one Polish sector on the left there that's unprofitable. So the dark blue is their current profitability. If we add those additional equipment costs, the capital costs, the machinery, we can see profitability drops down to the lighter blue, but it's still profitable. So 16 of the 17 segments that are currently profitable remain so. There's no segment here that drops below the line. So this is a really important conclusion of the study. And it might be a little surprising, but it's actually not new because the Commission actually looked at this in a 2018 study that they had done. Slightly different methodology, different year, so different economic baseline. But you can see it's pretty much the same here. So if you remember carp, we had an increase in production costs of about 12%. You can see carp there for their Poland, Germany, Romania. We had 2% for rainbow trout on the right. We had 1% for sea bass, sea bream. There seems to be convergence around that level of impact. So just wrapping up here, potentially some surprising results, but I think it's important to remember that the baseline profitability in this sector is actually pretty healthy. And you can't answer a question about economic feasibility without looking at the state of the industry today. And again, there's limited competition here from imports. Maybe another surprise. We often talk in the EU market about concerns with free trade agreements and products coming in from other jurisdictions. That's actually not a big concern for these finfish species. A concern, but not a big one. And lastly, just in the equipment cost compared to profitability, we see that the equipment costs actually have a relatively modest impact on overall production costs. Of course, the caveat, results are not uniform. It seems like carp is the biggest challenge here if we're going to think about focusing our efforts in different areas. And it's worth saying that actually funding is available. So the EU aquaculture funding is available to cover stunning equipment through, it's called the EMFAF. And lastly, we can also learn from the experience of countries like Norway, in which stunning technologies are now common and have legal requirements. And anyone who knows a bit about the industry knows they're very, very profitable in Norway. It seems to be going all right in their transition. So just wrapping up here, thinking about the kind of the role of economics in the discussion we've been having today. I think there's some key economic arguments that can be used here about product quality, about future proofing for potential standards that might come in from retailers, for example. But we should recognize that just as the economic benefits are real, so are the costs, and there's real trade-offs here. But the question from an economic perspective is whether those costs are feasible, and the results in this study seem to indicate they are. And just lastly, of course, financial feasibility is only one part here. Again, for context, 600 million finfishes every year being slaughtered, and that we haven't attached an economic value to, but need to keep that in mind. The reason why we're doing this in the first place. I wouldn't say economics is the motivator for action here, but it can help us address some of the obstacles for action. So the study is published online. It was published in December by Eurogroup for Animals. Have a look and please reach out with any questions.
Thank you very much, Griffin, for that really nice presentation on the economic visibility of stunning. It's definitely inspiring to see that there really is no reason why producers can't bring that in. And it's interesting that carp is the biggest challenge. Hopefully, MFAF funding can be brought to bear on that. And we'll share, Maya's sharing now the link to Griffin's report here, as well as the intergroup event that I mentioned. We don't have time because we're now over time. So I was just going to mention that Eurico and the GRN and ESR have another report on humane slaughter aquatic animals, which includes an economic aspect, and that's coming out in the next couple of months. So do keep an eye out for an email landing in your inbox from us, hopefully soon. Yeah, so we've reached the end of the session. I was hoping we'd have time to take some questions, but it's very late for many of us already. So I will wrap up by thanking our speakers one more time. And happy World Aquatic Animal Day. Please make sure to sign up to the GRN's newsletter. I think that's also in the chat now. And to follow both of us on social media. As always, the GRN will send a recording by email. And yes, we hope to see you all next year at the next World Aquatic Animal Day. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.